All right, welcome to the Nietzsche Dialogues, the first conversation in a series of conversations that I'm going to be hosting on this channel, which are aiming to the dialogue series as a whole, is aiming to approach some major themes in relationship to an upcoming course that I'm going to be giving on Thus Spoke Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche. In future dialogues, we're going to be talking about things like gurus, competition, nihilism and meaning, women, futures. And for this dialogue, starting us off, is maybe perhaps one of the most infamous topics relevant to Nietzsche's work, which is the topic of Christianity. You could say Nietzsche was obsessed by Christianity, whether positively or negatively. His philosophy functioned as a type of metaphysical bomb in the 20th century. I think many scholars and intellectuals would agree that Nietzsche had an enormous impact on our Western conceptions of religion, how many people in the world today, in the secular world today, understand religion. There are some fundamental concepts that I think have sort of disseminated throughout pop culture and have sort of become commonplace understandings. But I think in the context of this specific conversation, I'm excited here to bring on Paul Robson, who's a man I have collaborated with now for probably over a year and a half or so, and a man who has started an organization called Maniphesto, which I've collaborated with and participated with. So before we get into the metaphysical mess of Nietzsche and Christianity, I'll hand it over to you, Paul. Maybe give an introduction to the viewers, and maybe also a little bit of your relationship to Christianity and philosophy.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Cadell. And first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to come on here and have a discussion. I've really enjoyed having lots of discussions with you already, as a man who talks from his own heart and engages in a personal way in conversations. So I'm happy to be doing it on this subject as well, which I find very interesting. And I've been thinking a bit about it the last couple of days, having kind of ideas turning over my head. But yeah, I can start off by saying I'm not like an expert on Nietzsche or Christianity. I have spent most of my adult life as an atheist and a somewhat distant appreciator of Nietzsche's work, I guess. I read Thus Spake Zarathustra probably about 8-9 years ago, something like that, and have read more about him, I guess, as well. And found it's maybe, I'm not a philosopher. I'm educated as a political scientist, but I found very quickly through my education that I wasn't interested in being a bureaucrat working in an office. I preferred being more down on the ground and hands in the dirt kind of thing. So I had a career in a corporate career for many years, and then at some point, I won't give the whole story here, but ended up doing men's work and doing courses and events for men, creating male fellowships as a bit of an answer to the crisis that we're seeing in masculinity and just gender, how to be a man in today's society in many ways. And so that kind of started as a hobby, met some really interesting people while I was doing it, which made me use more and more time on it till today. It's a full-time job and an incredibly rewarding and valuable one as well, where I get to kind of understand myself a bit. But yeah, through that journey and trying to dig deeper into understanding myself and reality, I ended up, I think you wrote in the description that I'm a self-identified Christian. I'm an Orthodox Christian, actually. I converted after being a kind of, Richard Dawkins atheist for my entire adult life. I did grow up in a Christian home, but kind of rejected that after I left school, and still actually reject some of the main kind of ideas of the kind of Christianity that I grew up with. So for me, it was very much a journey back to the roots. Christianity is what was, it's back to what was practiced by the original Christians instead of the kind of separation that's happened and the fragmentation that's happened over the last, 2,000 years, or especially since the Great Schism 1,000 years ago, right? So yeah, I don't know. That was the broad brushstrokes? Is there anything specific otherwise you're thinking I should go into?
Sure. Well, I think that another important context is maybe to connect this to the Manifesto's European Men's Gathering. Is there an explicit connection there between the work you're doing with the Men's Gathering and Orthodox Christianity, or the larger sort of metaphysical transition you've gone through from a secular atheist in the Dawkins tradition to going back to the roots of Christianity that might be relevant?
Yeah. Well, let me first. So the European Men's Gathering is the biggest thing that I do every single year, which we started in 2017. We've had about 100 to 140 guys that come every single year. And when we first did it, then we decided like we need to understand this idea of rites of passage. This is something central that's missing in people's lives, and it's something that normally your kind of religious substructure provides, and many people in Western society today feel isn't being provided. And so we decided, well, let's try and create this and explore how to create a rites of passage that can help people to basically take the next step in maturity in their life. So doing as a kind of transformational event that one can get insights and integrate it and move to the next step. And so we've been working with that more and more. And obviously there's been a strong developmental process for me. And that will be happening again for now the 6th time here this summer, actually on the first weekend of August in Denmark, where we'll again have 150 guys coming. And a very, very powerful event. I wouldn't say that it's strongly related to what we're talking about today, because we take a very kind of pragmatic route or approach to that work. One thing that I make sure with my work is that I use Christianity to inform my own work ethic, my own approach to my personal life, my own kind of personal practices. But the European Men's Gathering is really a meeting place for people from different traditions. We kind of have a shared understanding that we see that there's a lot of chaos and confusion at the moment. And so connecting to a tradition is very, very valuable. But in Maniphesto, I'm working with, I'm actually one of the very few Christians in there. We have far more, Buddhists, New Age, pagans, secular atheists, scientists kind of guys, philosophers, all kinds of stuff. More and more, we're just seeing like normal people who, don't have a very strong position on this, but maybe are like entering into a phase of transition in their life and are looking for pragmatic, practical, down-to-earth tools for knowing how to navigate in kind of taking the next step or finding direction. So we're definitely not kind of trying to preach or propagate a specific tradition, but we do make people aware of the different traditions that are out there and get them to kind of try and understand some of the differences between them. So we'll have, often on the last day, we'll have a panel with, a guy who's a Zen Buddhist and a Zoroastrian and a Christian and, maybe, someone who does like some kind of some other practice, and we'll have a discussion between them, which will be a moderatory discussion, and we'll disagree about stuff, and then it's up to the participants really to figure out what they can find as value.
All right, I think that's great. That's great context for the conversation, and I think maybe the starting point for you and me specifically could be influence from Dawkins' atheism. So I also, you mentioned that you started your life or spent most of your adult life as an atheist. And I would say that I started certainly my intellectual life as an atheist. As soon as I started to explore intellectual ideas, I became fascinated by evolutionary theory. And I was strongly influenced by, I've read, of course, Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species, but many contemporary evolutionary theorists, and the Four Horsemen, including Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens, had a pretty big impact on me. And I think that's actually an interesting way to situate Nietzsche, because I would say that Dawkins' atheism, when I say Dawkins' atheism, I think I'm mostly referring to an atheism which is strongly informed by an evolutionary biological perspective on life in the universe, even up to the point where you can make metaphysical claims about religious institutions and social organization and stuff like this, can be differentiated in some ways from Nietzsche's atheism, and I guess the starting point for how I would sort of make that distinction is that while Nietzsche was responding, I think, metaphysically to the introduction of Darwin's ideas, namely that we come from life, namely that we are part of an organic, the organic world, that we have a history, a shared history with the animals. Nietzsche's atheism is really about not so much our historical connection to life so much, even though he accepts that, is more about the future. Is what does it mean for the future? And he's very future oriented. And what he takes as the principle of living in a, let's say, an evolutionary universe is that it means, well, we are evolutionary forms, which means we are going to be changing in time. And Nietzsche opens Thus Spoke Zarathustra with saying, what is a chimpanzee to a man? A laughing stock, a painful embarrassment. These are the types of words that he'll use to describe, maybe what you'll see if you go to the zoo and you look at the chimp versus if you look at a thing and an English gentleman or something like that. Like you get this painful embarrassment, a laughing stock throwing feces and stuff like that. And he uses that as an analogy to say, well, what will the future man, or what he calls the overman, or in other translations, the Superman, be to how will the overman or the Superman view contemporary man? And he says a laughing stock, a painful embarrassment. So he's trying to get, I think, with his atheism, he's trying to organize a different telos. That's how I understand what he's doing. He's trying to say, okay, we live in an evolutionary, and I think that's missing in the Dawkins atheism, because it's not so much that in the Dawkins atheism you get a strong telos to a different alternative higher vision, which is what we basically lose in the atheistic conception. So but what I'm basically arguing is that Nietzsche's offering some sort of higher telos, which is not God in another world, or not after this life, and that's his main concern. He doesn't want people thinking about I'm going to get what I want when I die in the afterlife. He wants people thinking that you are part of a larger process pointing beyond yourself in this world. So I think that might be an interesting place to start, and maybe give me sort of what ideas come to mind here.
Yeah, I definitely think Nietzsche has a stronger, kind of more well-rounded metaphysical understanding and a more complete kind of approach to these things. I mean, Dawkins takes very much a kind of bottoms-up view on reality, and so everything that can be proven and shown by science is kind of included, and he kind of disregards everything outside of that. Whereas I think Nietzsche is far more ambitious in many ways. So I just listened to your recent YouTube video, or I didn't get through all the way through it, but I listened to the first half of it, and I just was struck by how much you talking about him. I felt Nietzsche was like this Christ-like figure, actually, in so many ways. I really felt like this very powerful Christ-like figure. And basically, he was just, what I see him doing is exploding a misaligned, kind of lost, full of errors, Western, especially 19th century German Christianity, which is basically, I saw him actually reestablishing what were Orthodox Christian truths. For example, like you spoke about, the soul and the body and the relationship between them. And it's oh, wow, yeah, that's exactly the way I see it as well. And then you spoke about living for this world and not living for another world. It's oh, yes, that's exactly how I see it as well. So I really see, obviously he never found Christ, because the only access he had to Christ was through the institutions that were around him and the understanding that was around him. But this is a longer discussion, which I won't go into now. But he's a very Christ-like figure in many ways in what he was putting forward. And so Dawkins has a slightly different role.
Yeah, so maybe that's an interesting another interesting place to jump off of, because when we think about Christ-like figures, maybe we could go in a little bit into what you mean by Christ-like figure. But when I think Christ-like figure, I think about a figure who is affirming a type of ethical struggle against sort of secular powers which are seen to be exploiting the masses, or somehow
Suffer for the truth.
suffering for that's what I mean by like the ethical struggle is you're suffering for the truth. And I think that there's no question to me in my reading of Thus Spoke Zarathustra that we have here an individual who is suffering for the truth. So what do you think, maybe first go into a little bit more, unpack the idea of the Christ-like figure, and then maybe we could compare the relationship between Nietzsche's atheism and Dawkins' atheism as it relates to their own historical inclusion in their work. Because with Nietzsche, like he's fully there, and like I feel like with Dawkins, Dawkins as a person is not really like, he's giving you a scientific worldview, but I don't see him deeply included, in the same way that maybe Nietzsche is including himself. But maybe first, let's talk about what is a Christ-like figure.
Of Jonathan Peugeot, he has a channel called The Symbolic World, which is really just about like looking for symbolic patterns in reality. And so, I don't know if he would use this way, but the way I see it is like the story of Christ is a fundamental pattern, right? It's you can call it, the part of it is like the hero's journey or something like that. You talk a lot about like going into the abyss and like, pushing Christianity to its own abyss. And in some ways, that's where Christianity belongs, in the abyss, right? And so it's like a way of things laying themselves out. It's this kind of like push and pull between structure and anti-structure, you can call it, which I think is very relevant for Nietzsche as well. And I think that's just something that's been repeated throughout history. You can find traces of it in Viking mythology, in ancient Sumerian. I just read recently the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it's just like amazing how many of the exact same patterns are just repeating there all the time. And so when we're aware of these patterns, so as an Orthodox Christian, I believe that Christ kind of like maxes out the patterns. He is the ultimate representation of these things, and the kind of clearest, most high resolution version of it, or something like that. But I think that Nietzsche was certainly in many ways bringing us back to the pattern, the basic pattern, which had been lost in many ways.
Yeah. So I mean, it makes sense that Nietzsche, in that context, it makes a lot of sense that Nietzsche has had an outsized influence on 20th century theology and philosophy. If he's sort of, let's say, in that language, maxing out the pattern and bringing us back to foundational thinking about religious issues. I would also be interested in thinking, like, for example, with like my interpretation of the Gilgamesh story versus someone like Christ or someone like Nietzsche, is that, correct me if I'm wrong as well, but in the Gilgamesh story, he's looking for immortality in the epic, whereas someone like, can we say Christ is looking for immortality in a sense? Because in some sense, I see him as a sacrificial being, that he's sacrificing, any illusions of immortality. And I think Nietzsche as well, like Nietzsche emphasizes so much, your basic finitude and your passing away, that you are not infinite. He says, he despises all infinite worlds. I'm here to take away all infinite worlds, all. That really your job is to sacrifice yourself for a much larger process.
Yeah, so I just today was at church, actually. That's why I'm wearing my nice shirt. You probably haven't seen me with a nice shirt on. The guy along there, his wife had brought him along. He hated going.
I thought you got dressed up for the talk.
No, I decided to keep it on, especially for you, Cadell.
Yes, okay.
Anyway, but no, so but he spoke. I just was chatting with him, and he just kind of started talking about when he was 16, his dad died. And then at his dad's funeral, then the priest was standing up on the stage there and talking about how how great it is that he's being called home, and now his dad has gone home. And he just said he was just sitting there like, doing everything he could to stop himself from going up on the stage and like hitting that priest in the face, basically. So not being able to, at all, or this is a common thing that we see, like that, and I think you refer to it as something like is living for a next life and not for this one here, or something like that. And I think that is something that is absolutely core and vital, and something that has become like we call it spiritual bypassing today, right? Is that I think most of Western society has become extremely gnostic, and we can go into a lot of detail about what that's about, but I think that's what we're seeing in the whole kind of like, transgender debate and all that kind of stuff as well. It's like a rejection of the physical, of this, the reality of this existence that we're in right now, and a kind of escaping up into ethereal levels that are disconnected from our present reality.
I think the place that's most alive for me is when I was growing up, and especially I was maturing as an intellectual. My ideas of, like, if you asked me when I was 20, and even if you ask me today, although I have a much maybe richer and more complex view of things, but if you were asking me in my 20s, what are like the major ideas of Christianity? And like, I think the ideas I would say are, well, there's heaven in the afterlife. I think that would be like one thing, like that's a major idea. There's heaven in the afterlife, that your ethical or moral behavior in this life has an influence on whether or not you get into heaven in the afterlife, and that if you have a certain moral or ethical behavior in this life which is not in accordance with God's will, then you could be sent to hell. Mm-hmm. And then maybe connected to that is that there's two worlds, that there's the secular world and there's the supernatural, or there's the natural world and the supernatural world, and that the supernatural world has a dimension of eternity to it, and the natural world has a dimension of temporality to it. So if we unpack those ideas, is like, and I think Nietzsche goes after each of those ideas in his own way. Mm-hmm. When you say you're going to the roots of Christianity, to Orthodox Christianity, and you are sort of trying to get away from the fragmentation of Christianity that happened in history, how are you approaching these sort of what I take to be bedrock notions of Christian metaphysics?
Yeah. Well, first of all, like, Christianity isn't like a belief system that you can kind of read a book and buy into. It's a kind of, it's not something you can also just understand in your head and then it's all good. And it's especially not just something like you say, like, oh, I believe in Jesus and now everything's great and now I'm saved or something like that. That's a terrible misunderstanding of what it's about. The idea that like good people go to heaven and bad people go to hell, not a Christian idea at all. That's something that's very recent. It's not, you'll never find that. Actually, like in biblical sources and also in the church fathers, all references to hell is always for Christians, actually, not for non-Christians. And I get that as a Christian. Like I know what hell is. I can experience it. I don't think I have to wait until I die to experience it in any way. I think I can experience it right now. And I think, there's been a lot of misunderstandings and misinterpretations of the Bible, especially, when you've kind of like taken one part of church tradition and cut off all the rest of it and then said, okay, well, now we're going to interpret this one part of church tradition in the Bible through a kind of modernist scientific mindset and almost see it as a historical scientific textbook. You're going to get a lot of really bad results. Like, you get a lot of misunderstandings. And so, the Orthodox approach is really to say to people, like, come and see, just like, come into a church and experience it. And so basically, like, theology is not something you can study at university. Theology is something that is taught through the experiencing of the divine services of the church and in your own life as well. So it's through, like, a prayer rules. It's through going to, like, the church year, where you have the 12 great feasts of the church year, and you experience the divine liturgy as a transcended ritual that kind of transports you into another place when you're doing that. And it's really it's a small burden of like, focusing your attention on something that is intended and built in a very complex way to lift you higher. But it's not something you can get through watching YouTube videos or reading books or something like that.
Okay, so let me see. So like in terms of let's like take the idea of heaven and hell. I mean, you could say, does the Orthodox Christian Church or you personally, whatever way you want to take it, are these conceived of as their own ontological realities independent of this world, or are they interpreted as sort of metaphors for our experience? Like, so for example, if you have your heart broken, if you're, if your partner breaks up with you, so for example, if in my past, when I've had breakups, I've gone through, let's say, soul experiences in my body that feel like hell, like, and they give me major orientation checks in terms of my behavior and what I would like to avoid going forward, and or the types of behavior I would like to embody moving forward, which makes sense to me. Then you have the idea of heaven and hell as their own ontological realities, which, say, for example, have eternal dimensions or something like that. That is, what do you make of these distinctions?
I kind of like try and go for the third way because the one way is trying to again see biblical descriptions as describing a scientific reality in Western scientific terms, which didn't exist by the people who wrote the Bible, right? Like when the Bible was written by human beings, and they were living, a long time ago, up to many thousands of years ago, and so they were describing, not trying to describe ontological categories or anything like that. They were telling a story. That's basically what the Bible is. It's there's obviously different types of literature in the Bible, but the overall idea of the Bible is that it's a story. So it's not like a series of claims of truth that you need to believe in to then be saved. That's a misunderstanding. It's based on a kind of very modernist Western idea of kind of like objective truth somehow, that we have to establish objective truth, which is very valuable in the sciences for exploring the physical world, but it's just not a very useful way for understanding the Bible, because the Bible was never created to be that way. So I approach the Bible more. So if you ask about like the idea of heaven, well, Christ has multiple parables where he says, this is what the kingdom of heaven is like. And then he talks about like, a sheep farmer who loses a sheep, or he talks about a woman who, loses a coin or something like that. Or, there's many, many different parables of that, where it's kind of giving a pointer towards a reality somehow that exists outside of our, he also says the kingdom of heaven is within you. So it's not like, it's not like these are precise scientific definitions, but it's something for you to go and explore in your own experience if you trust the words of Christ, I guess, somehow. And so you can kind of approach it somehow. And I think that's
so the one way, you said you take the third way, which is so I'm interested in this. So like the one way you see as basically, let's say, the literalist interpretation of heaven is a real place that you go to after you die, say, or hell is a real place you go to after you die, that is a retroactive projection from Western modernist science.
And it's not even accurate biblically. Like, you definitely don't go to hell if you die. Like if you're a bad person, like that's not in the Bible. It's like the people are confused different categories of like, eternal damnation and Hades, and it's not a correct understanding. But so
then the second way would be that we interpret these as psychological realities, right? Like that we interpret these as like, hell or heaven as sort of let's say symbols or placeholders for very high or very low valenced experience.
Yeah, I guess that could be.
Mm-hmm. So then in that sort of two interpretations, what do you see as the third way? So like if
It's
you have on the one
recovering
hand
the
the
mind of the
projection.
people who were the original intended audience of the Bible, to understood like how they understood it. So it for me, it entails stepping out of like my training, that I've trained my mind very well to be like kind of think in Western rational terms, and actually go back and, you know, obviously most of the time in my life I do think in these Western literal ways, but there's also a certain dysfunction about it. And so when I read the Bible, then I try and understand it through the way that they understood it. And so real didn't mean the same as objective, verifiable, peer-reviewed article, journals, things, or truth didn't have that same meaning to it. I think Aristotle even was, you know, when you talk about history, like history is it's I think the word is episteme. It's not like the objective truth in the same way. It's more of a matter of opinion. You know, we can't verify history. There's no way of doing that. So attempts to turn history into a science are kind of not going to pass, right? So it's a story. It's a very human story. And it was a story, you know, where people had a very, I guess, phenomenologically orientated mindset. Like that's the way they experienced the world. And but these stories are deeply truthful in a way that isn't scientific, but that it in a level of meaning, and a meaning of, yeah, a level of kind of like the patterns of reality somehow. And you know, when I opened up just my mind to that possibility, then everything fell into place, right? That was my experience of it. It's like it was the insistence on that kind of Western rational mindset that was just stopping me from seeing it.
Okay, so like I think that might be an interesting place to juxtapose. You again, correct me if I'm wrong. That in the let's say your early adult life, you were in a Western rational mindset of basically, let's say, a Dawkins atheism, and then there was a sort of transition into more the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, or the Petersonian universe, where there is the sort of the acceptance of, let's say, Western rational science, but there's also a place for Christianity among other religious interpretations. And the way I always understood this phenomenon was that whereas the Dawkins atheism could rationally articulate the ideas of an evolutionary universe, Peterson's understanding of the evolutionary universe is that we have to include within our Western rationality a more, let's say, what's the word I'm looking for? Pathological view of the human body, that because we were a part of the evolutionary universe, we can't just pretend we're just rational minds, that we have an irrational component that's related to the, let's say, the raw sensations and the evolutionary history of the body, that themselves need attention and training, and that perhaps religion, historically speaking, was a way for ancient humans to train that pathos. And what I mean by pathos is the unmediated desires of the body, and the unmediated lust and sexual aggression and violence and killing. Like, there's often this sort of way in which, let's say, the Western rational liberal is aware that we're in an evolutionary universe, but not really deeply in touch with the fact that they have sexual desires and they are killing machines, and like, you are dangerous, and like, and you have to actually be in touch and train those parts of yourself. And so I felt like, for example, when Peterson did his biblical lecture series, I think the important thing about that lecture series was that he was emphasizing the psychological significance of the biblical stories to train their mind for these types of things. So maybe what's your view on it?
I think Peterson was very instrumental in my journey. Absolutely. When I first started watching Peterson, I was fully an atheist. I remember him saying one thing which really kind of stuck with me, which was just like, if you take this Bible, the book's over 2,000 years old, some of the stories in it are over 10,000 years old. Like, you have to contend with this thing. You can't just write it off as fairy tales or something like that. You have to at least take it seriously and consider what it's about. And so that was a kind of clue for me. It's like, well, maybe our ancestors weren't as stupid as we think we are. Actually, maybe we're the distracted, kind of lost and confused ones, because we filled our lives with, just like all kinds of, we're very out of touch with reality most of the time, right? Like, just seeing how this Ukraine-Russia war has suddenly like woken some people up out of a kind of a zombie state. It's clear like that, like, the lives of comfort and ease that we're living has disconnected a lot of people from actually being in touch with what's real. So I think that he's doing a very important role. I think Jordan Peterson did kind of like give people a little bit of slap in the face to a certain extent and get them up again. And then where I see he's struggling is just in his individualism. So he kind of, sees still very centered everything around the individual person and what that person is doing for themselves in order to move themselves forward. And so I think that's, that's something that it's exciting to kind of follow where he's going at the moment and seeing what's happening. But I definitely, that's one area where I still see him struggling and not connecting properly, is that the same patterns that happen on the individual level, they're happening at the lower level, and they're also happening at a higher level as well.
Okay, so as far as I understand Peterson, he gives the argument that actually Christianity was an important historical innovation for the concept of individualism. So I don't know, I don't necessarily have a say.
No, I think science was necessary to be built on Christianity as well, and individualism, and I think like Western society was largely built on Christianity. I think, it's like there's actually this idea from Hegel. So you're an expert on Hegel, right? Like that like, if you need to see ideas that in philosophy as like kind of like the flower at the end of a long branch, and you can't just take that flower without understanding the branch and the stem and the tree and the roots. So you have to kind of go all the way back to understand where things have come from. And so absolutely, I think that, I mean, a core moment that from at least has helped my understanding of what's happening in Western society at the moment is to go back. I mentioned right at the beginning, the Great Schism. I think it was 1032. It's where the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church split off from each other. The main reason why they split is because the Roman Catholic Church, they wanted to have one man as the sole authority and head of the church, whilst the Orthodox Church, they had multiple patriarchs in multiple different cities. And so there was a kind of excess of power and authority placed in a singular pointed head of the church, whereas the Orthodox Church kept itself as more of the body, right? A more integrated body. And so for me, this has just been, it's so easy to trace out how this has then developed in Western society, is that we've focused too much power and attention always up on the head. That's why we have the celebrity culture. We call them even stars, right? We're obsessed with people, with the head and with the power. This is also the Nietzschean will to power. It's where, for me, that's where it comes from. You don't see these same problems to the same extent of individualism and kind of like the one being the one on the top in Orthodox countries as well. So it's very related. Absolutely.
Well, I think at least from what I understand of Peterson, with the idea that Christianity was essential for the idea of individualism, is that it's in relationship to the state. That in sacrifice, so in the metaphor, in God coming down to earth as an individual human being and sacrificing himself in relationship to the power structures of his day, he was sort of and that story becoming the central symbol of the Christian religion. Like when you go into a church, you have, or when you ever see Christian symbolism, it's not Buddha sitting on a yoga mat. It's a man nailed to a cross. And that has a certain power to it, because it's, my interpretation, which I think is the Hegelian interpretation, is that the universal has become particular. That God has, the universal has particularized himself in an individual, and that individual has a certain ontological primacy, that you can't you can't use the universal as the state power to abuse or manipulate or control the individual. That's and I'm not sure if so. What do you that's my interpretation, and that Christianity, that this is Peterson's, that Christianity was an important metaphysical force in that regard, because I guess he might make the argument that many metaphysical ideas before that, or assumptions or dogmas, would not give a ontological primacy to the individual. And I think, of course,
Yeah.
I think in the Enlightenment, this all becomes more well thought through, let's say, because you have embedded in our sort of secular institutions individual rights, and a whole consequence of that, we have the differentiation of different rights movements, whether they're women's rights, whether they're racial rights, whether they're, rights get extended, ad infinitum.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think, that if you look at like all societies before Christ, then there was no appreciation of the unique value of every single individual in human life. Like that just wasn't a thing. Like people, if you'd said that to people in the Roman Empire, they would have laughed at you, right? Like Rome was built by like invading other civilizations and enslaving their peoples, and taking their wives, whatever. Like that was just the way things were done. And so after Christ, like that changed. And so that was a very powerful idea, and so it's built on, it comes from the Old Testament, that, but it really was able to expand out of Judaism, and Judaism also, like there's a long discussion about how that was implemented as well, and how it changed with Christ. But also, like, as far as the equal value of men and women, that just, women were property for most civilizations before Christ as well, and so that was changed after that time. And so the problem, though, is that when you kind of unhook these ideas from their Christian foundation, then you see that if you look at the rights movement today, I once dated a woman who works for the Danish Human Rights Organization, and there's a kind of an expansion of reach, an expansion of one's own territory within that set of terms, which leads them to kind of going further and further out into more and more aspects of life, and getting further out than what they should be. And so that's why we see very dysfunctional rights-based movements today, where those terms are getting abused and just.
Can you give some examples? Can you give some examples of where you feel the expansion of the concept of rights in the context of being disconnected from maybe their underlying religious or metaphysical foundation, are going farther than they should be?
With their people have, we've never had a society of people that have been so comfortable that people are just they're obsessed with what their rights are and not what their responsibilities are. So people don't see themselves as beings with responsibilities anymore. There's just this excessive focus on rights. And so you'll see people who, like haven't earned an honest day's wage in their life, but are expecting to, have everything given to them because they believe it's right. So, there's more and more things. And we also see like animals getting the same rights, or a movement for like, speciesism or anti-speciesism. And then, internet becomes a right, and this becomes a right, and that becomes a right. It's like, in the Bible, Paul writes something like, if you don't work, then you don't get to eat, kind of thing. This is specifically to Christian ministers, not to the broad population. He's saying to Christian ministers, like, if you don't, if you want to eat, then you got to work. So I think rights needs to be balanced with responsibilities. That's I guess where it goes off, and then also when you start applying the same rights to other species, then I think that's when you're also heading into danger.
Okay, maybe to try to bring it back around to maybe what I interpret to be the most important distinction between Nietzsche and Christianity is the distinction between God and the overman. So for Nietzsche, he sees God as a sort of metaphysical principle, again, existing in another world, promising an afterlife, getting people to worship him, let's say, having a sort of ontological primacy in terms of creativity, over human creativity. And he sees the overman as basically the opposite of that. The overman is connected to this world. The overman is a process of overcoming the human condition. So it's not a sort of reification of what humans are now. It's a struggle with what we are now, and almost a contempt for what we are now, to go beyond ourselves for something more than ourselves, but only ever thought about as a process in this world, and not, again, some sort of supernatural dimension. So how, like, your sensibilities, what do you make of this distinction? What's a visceral reaction to this distinction? And how does it sit with you?
Yeah, I think I completely agree with that. I think it's a useful tool to understand one's own life. I think perhaps it one thing that could be dangerous with it is that it's not connected to, or it's not inherently connected to a set of practices. So there's some beautiful philosophical writing about it that one can then go and implement, but it's not connected to a set of practices, and it's also not connected to a committed community. Which is, I find, very useful and valuable tools for actually, implementing beautiful ideas in one's life. Because, we're often our own worst enemies, and we kind of hijack ourselves or sabotage our own lives, or spiritual bypass, and our egos have ways of kind of making us miss these things. But as far as like its compatibility, if you look at, so the Christian church, so the Orthodox Church, I should need to say it, I saw some of the comments, there's been something about like, about institutionalized Christianity. And so a lot of people say like, oh, I love Christ, or I love spirituality, or whatever. This is all great, but like the institution, I don't agree with. And I think the way that I look at this is like, the Orthodox Church is a very institutionalized church. It's a very structured church. And there's a church hierarchy, and there's bishops and, all kinds of other people in them. And you can find some real assholes in the church hierarchy. Any hierarchy, there's going to be people who misuse that hierarchy to get themselves into positions of power. And of course that exists in the church as well. But the church also has a second hierarchy, one could say, which is the saints. And so we're not supposed to be kind of, using the bishops and these kind of people always as the examples of how to live, but it's actually the saints. And when you describe the overman and that kind of that struggle against, in this life, then that for me exactly harmonizes with the reading that I've had of the Orthodox saints, where it's about, so Orthodoxy believes in theosis, and theosis is a process of deification in this life, and there are many people who've reached the state of being in that state, and it typically doesn't always look like what people expect it to look like, but when you meet one of these people, you know it as well. Mm-hmm.
And so what is the process of theosis, of a deification in this life? What is there a set of practice, like you say, is there a set of practices? I'm assuming it's connected to a certain community, organization, or something like that. Could you, or I mean, if you want to, could you go into
it's the entire life of the Orthodox Church, but it's most commonly connected to monasticism. So there are plenty of non-monastic saints in the Orthodox tradition, but I guess it's about like, that journey into the abyss that we spoke about. It is about, I think, the key to it is often is repentance. So the idea that, like embracing imperfection, that you speak about as well, of taking that in on yourself as well. And then, there's a deep kind of meditative, contemplative tradition called Hesychism, which is most strongly connected to this Orthodox tradition as well. So there's a kind of contemplative process to go through. That's it. It's something that I don't have any ambitions within myself to make significant progress, but it's also like it's something that you can't. I don't know. The way it's seen is like it's a synergy between yourself and God. You need to choose it, but you have, there's a top down and a bottoms up element to it that needs to happen. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, I'm just trying to get deeper into this distinction between God and the overman, and in many ways, I see Thus Spoke Zarathustra as attempting to set forth a series of ethical principles by which one can organize one's life around overcoming what one is, for a deeper, richer, in spiritual terms, deeper, richer, more expansive, natural, and worldly being. And in that sense, Nietzsche sees the concept of God, which is often associated with principles of perfection, transcendent being, supernatural creativity, omniscience, as in the way of that investigation. So do you see it as clear cut as this, or do you see it as, or I mean, maybe it's too simplistic to say, do you fall on one side or the other of that distinction? Because that's a distinct. I mean, I think like that distinction makes a lot of sense to me, because like when I was growing up, the Christians I would speak to and the Christians that I would interact with, they would have based their entire ethical foundation around a God in another world, that God is perfect love, that God knows everything, that God created everything. It's like that. So, I mean, that distinction that Nietzsche's making to me is clear. And it's kind of like the way he presents it in Thus Spoke Zarathustra is it's either or. Like you live your life by that principle, or you live your life by this principle. And again, I think that what Nietzsche's doing in setting up basically a secular spirituality is that he's trying to avoid what he calls the last man, which is a man of comfort, stability, pleasure, short-term thinking, and I could go on about the principles of the last man, but anyway, I think that
the only distinction I would have is like, I get it why people kind of, they say these things like God is love and like I just base my life on that and then everything's going to be great. The Orthodox understanding is like God. So there is that belief that is true, and at the same time that we don't have access to it. So as a human being, like I don't have access to higher spiritual realities. We can never experience God. It would kill us if we did. So the idea of like, hell being fire comes from this idea of like, being impure yourself and presented with perfect goodness, it would burn you because it's so powerful. So that's where, that comes from. So I think as a human being, I'm forced to live what I would say like the Nietzschean way, but I get strength from doing it because I believe there is something beyond that. And I think the only way you can get that is through revelation. So if you haven't had that revelation, I think the Nietzschean way is a very good way to live, because then maybe you will one day earn that revelation. Like a lot of people have a mystical experience in their life, and they see something greater, and this then drives people for the rest of their life. And so that's something that happened to me, right? I'm very appreciative of it, but before I had that mystical experience, that kind of that thing that I saw, then then Nietzsche was a good tool to be using in many ways, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think and that's what everyday life is for me as well, most of the time, because I don't walk around and see angels every day or something like that, right? Like most of the time I have the same experience, but I also know that like I've seen something that's going to change the rest of my life, and it'll never go away, and that'll always continue to influence the way that I am in the world. But I get it, like not everybody has that. And if you don't have it, then like, you shouldn't try and let some fundamentalist Bible basher Christian like hit you over the head with it and tell you that it's true, because like it needs to be true for you, not just, like something that you've understood intellectually or something like that. These things have to be embodied realities for them to actually work. And that's where the problem is again. It's too much head. Do we just think it's just about taking ideas from my head and putting to someone else's head and then everything's going to be great? It's like, it's not like that. You actually have to experience things. So, it depends who you're talking to and where you're going, what kinds of things you're going to experience as well, So am I putting myself where I'm organizing myself around, you know, like finding the overman, or am I organizing myself in a way where I'm just distracting myself with pleasure and whatever it is, right, that I'm trying to get through the time. Yeah.
Right. So it seems to me like at least the fundamental distinction I'm finding here that separates the two views is the idea of a beyond, and almost the idea that the idea of a beyond is needed to instantiate a drive, and that without that, without, you know, you don't have the strength, without the strength of belief in the beyond, then there you lose the motivational substructure or the motivational.
It's certainly a bigger risk of it when you're faced with tragedy. Like most people will be faced with terrible, terrible tragedy somewhere through their lives. Normally, if you're not, then that's actually sometimes can go worse for you, right? It's like often tragedy helps people because it puts them in touch with something greater or bigger, right? But yeah, like there's a big risk that, like, as long as life is comfortable and easy, then you can find drive and purpose and all that kind of stuff. But, you know, if you've really experienced betrayal, if you've really experienced someone like, you know, putting a knife in your back who you loved, then it's far more difficult to pick up the pieces and continue going, and not to turn to hate if you don't believe there's anything else.
So yeah, I think that it again highlights, I think, the distinction between Nietzsche and Christianity, which is like for you know, the way Nietzsche talks in Thus Spoke Zarathustra is that he almost, and I think he sees this as necessary for the overman, is well, one, he sees the idea in a beyond and the idea of a positive existence of God after this life as a delusion, where you're going to stop your actual becoming and you're going to freeze yourself basically with this image. And he says that when you're faced with he almost thinks this is a condition for the overman, that when you're faced with tragedy like betrayal, and it's the pieces or an untimely death, that you almost have to condition yourself to enjoy this negativity and see it as the power of your becoming. And the crucial thing here for Nietzsche is that you can't pity yourself. Like, I think the ultimate negative emotion in the bad sense for Nietzsche is if you pity yourself. So if you're betrayed by someone and then you just carry around the memory of that betrayal for the rest out of some sort of pity, like he has this fantastic parable in Thus Spoke Zarathustra where he's sleeping under a tree and a snake comes and bites him and puts poison in his arm. And then the snake tries to scurry off, and Nietzsche says, "Oh, hold on." He grabs the snake. He's like, "I have to give you back your venom because you're not strong enough to give this to me." So he's trying to articulate this point that the overman has so much spirit that even if you're betrayed, you treat the person who betrayed you almost as good as you would treat a friend. Like, he has also this line where he says, "I'm so spiritually rich that I give more to my enemies than you can give to your friends." So anyway, I'm just trying to articulate the way he's thinking. Is what he's thinking is that the overman is not someone who pities themselves if they've encountered tragedy, or not someone that pities themselves if they've experienced betrayal, but actually sees that as the expansion and the deepening of the spirit in this world.
Yeah.
Well, that's the logic.
Yeah. And so, like, you know, can one do that on one's own strength, or does one need divine help? Or, you know, of course, if you reject the idea of divine help, you have to do it by yourself. And I respect someone who has that ambition. I think that's a beautiful ambition to have. And I'd say, you know, go for it, because that's a beautiful standard to live for yourself, to put for yourself. And if you can do it, then, like, wow, I'm just going to be amazed. That's beautiful if someone can live that way. I tried, and what I found is that I'm actually quite weak, and I'm like, you know, very reliant on other people and on connection, and so for me, like, what happened is when I reached out for help for something, then, like, the help came. So it was like an experience of, like, fitting into reality, whereas, like, the individualist mindset of me doing things in my own strength, it didn't work. It didn't work in nearly the same way. The moment I dropped, it's all about me and I just have to do it, and then I can like be, it's basically it's a self-deification. Whereas when I let go of the self-deification and said like, okay, well, maybe if I want to become God, then maybe I can reach out to something greater that's already there. Then it just worked. It worked. Then like, I received it. But maybe I've just become the last man in some people's minds, and I'm okay with that. I'm okay with people.
I don't think Nietzsche would call religious believers the last man. I think what he would call the last man is the human that's organized by pleasure, comfort, and a sort of immediate gratification.
And a lot of Christianity is today, right? It's like, I mean, it's we have the.
I think a lot of society today is the last man.
Yeah. We're increasingly headed that way. Like
yeah, exactly. So in that sense, I think it's prophetic. I don't necessarily see Nietzsche saying that the religious person is the last man. I see Nietzsche saying the religious person is laboring under a delusion which needs to be transitioned to the earth. That's, I think, the simplest. I think that's what Nietzsche would say. Is that, and so
I would agree with that. I'd absolutely agree with that. I think that we've mistakenly put God up in heaven, far away, and all kind of gnostic and airy-fairy. I think that, every single morning, like the Orthodox prayer starts with like, Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth, who is everywhere present and filling all things. That's the Orthodox understanding of God, is that it's very immanent as well as being transcendent. So it's not it's like when you initially wrote to me these 4 points that you had about like where Christianity and Nietzsche conflict, then what I just thought is, well, like, this is all true and right, but it's just looking at things from a bottoms up perspective. And so what I think is like, we have this idea that I want to like base all my decisions on like what I really know through my own experience. But I would say like, you're actually just unaware of how you are influenced by top-down thinking actually as well, because if you look down bottoms up, then reality is just like the seething chaos of quantum fields and whatever it is, right? So it's like you don't even know what to look for to start creating ideas or categories if you just start bottom up. So we have to combine bottoms up and tops down thinking, and so that's just, I'm just explicit about what it is. Like the idea that you can be objective, I think it's a totally, you're so much a part of a culture, way of thinking, a taxonomy of being. There's no way you can get out of that. So it's just, this idea of like secular modernism or postmodernism as well, that you can, well, postmodernism at least realizes how subjective everything is, right? But they just don't have an answer for it. But that's what I see. So Jonathan Pajot and all these guys are talking about the re-enchantment of reality. And I think that's what we're seeing now, is in a very big way.
Well, I guess a few points on that is that certainly Nietzsche's capable of seeing the bottoms up perspective of the seething chaos, and also the fact that is in the context of, say, like the quantum physical view of the universe, where it's no longer a deterministic clockwork. There's an indeterminacy inherent to reality. I think that Nietzsche is well aware of that. I think that the main distinction, and again, that's sort of the distinction I tried to highlight, I think we have made some progress in understanding a little more of that distinction, is that Nietzsche's top-down view is the overman, whereas the religious top-down view tends to be God. Yeah. And so I think that and it's a simple distinction, and it is no necessarily, I think it's at the end of the day, it's like an ethical, it comes down to an ethical determination within someone's own sort of metaphysical search, whether or not they would say, the overman, or they would say God, and accept sort of the metaphysical baggage that comes with those assumptions, let's say. Yeah. But in terms of the impossibility of objectivity, I think this is where I think Nietzsche has to be understood as situated within the post-Hegelian philosophical tradition, because Hegel actually, in my view, solves the problem of the subject and object, because he formulates objectivity in spiritual terms. And he identifies a form of knowing, which he calls absolute knowing, which he says is objective. And so this is where he unifies subject and object in a form of objective knowing. And it's from that standpoint, that post-Hegelian philosophy even becomes possible at all. So like a figure like Nietzsche, or a figure like, we could go through the list of post-Hegelian philosophy. So in that sense, it's not simply that, the postmodern view that everything's a subjectivist interpretation. What Hegel would say is that what it matters is the standpoint from which the subject knows. So for example, if a 15-year-old says something about a topic versus someone who's gone on a deep spiritual quest and it, has matured over a long time and has, let's say in Nietzsche's term, ripened into a juicy spiritual fruit, then those are not the same things. Those are not the same things.
Yeah, well, I mean, for me, I'm not very comfortable with that idea of like absolute knowing or objective knowing, because I would say like a saint could kind of sometimes maybe in some ways approach that, but there's this kind of metaphor. It's like you don't know what it's like to be a bat. And so when we talk about like things like, like heaven or whatever as well, it's like I'm very careful about saying anything about it, because like I don't know what it's like. I only have the experience of here, so I can talk about my experiences of like the internal experiences right now, but the idea is that like God's essence is not, it's not something that we can even talk about in rational ways. So the Orthodox definition of God, that there's a quote from actually in this book right now. It's called Saint Maximus the Confessor, and he says something like, it is more accurate to say that God does not exist because he doesn't belong in the categories of anything that exists. So it's better to say God does not exist than he exists. So this is called the apophatic definition of God, which is the standard approach of Orthodox understanding of God. There are examples of the cataphatic definition, but it's not the dominant discourse, and they're not seen as in conflict with each other either.
Yeah, I like the idea of thinking about a God that does not exist, but that its non-existence has a sort of positive valence to it. And I think that also separates a figure like Dawkins atheism and maybe what Nietzsche's trying to go through with his metaphysics, which is that just because something does not exist, that doesn't mean it doesn't have that its inexistence doesn't have a positive valence. Like this is a very interesting idea. And I think it's also something that makes sense in a quantum physical view. But maybe let's try to bring the conversation full circle in some ways. Is like I think we started by giving sort of our own personal histories a little bit in terms of like I think we both come from a similar starting point in terms of a type of a scientific atheism. And I suppose for myself, I've found my spiritual path along the philosophical trajectory, and you've sort of found your trajectory along the religious trajectory. And it's interesting what brings that together in the people who watch my channel will know this. So what brings that together in a Hegelian perspective is that he has the idea that the absolute path in history is structured by a triad between philosophy, religion, and art. So Hegel has the idea that if a subject finds its spiritual objectivity in religion, or a subject finds its spiritual objectivity in philosophy, or spiritual objectivity in art, that all of those are manifestations of the becoming of the absolute. That's the idea. So in that sense, I think that we're capable of holding a higher order discourse like we're doing now between Nietzsche and Christianity, where there are opposed views, but there may be productive contradictions in these views. So maybe give some of your final thoughts for the viewers on maybe where you think Christianity might be today in a very secular culture, and maybe even I don't know if you would call it a post-religious culture. Do you see Christianity as something that's undergoing a revival and maybe a new historical interpretation and maybe situate yourself in that process? How do you see yourself as engaged in that larger potential phenomenon?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in my own personal Christian practice, I'm really so I've just started this semester studying theology. So I'm like taking like, basic 101 theology classes at the moment. So I'm really just finding my feet in that. And that's my main goal. This is the first time I'm really having a public conversation about Christianity, actually, in some way. And I certainly have no desire to like engage in apologetics or trying to prove God to people or something like that. That seems like a rather misguided idea. So what I am interested in is having fruitful dialogues with good ideas and good thinkers, with other ideas, and not always necessarily from the point of perspective of being a Christian, because especially my work, where most of my kind of online presences, especially, I'm not trying to promote a Christian system in any way whatsoever. I'm actively looking at pragmatics. So what works for people who don't call themselves Christians, and how can we enter into these discussions? And so I have noticed a pattern. Like some of the guys who I work very closely with, a lot of volunteers, and a lot of like the most hardworking volunteers are Christians. They have this like good work ethic. I don't know if that's the Calvinists or something like that. That tends to be like the new agey
Protestant work ethic.
Yeah, I think something like that. Yeah. So there's definitely like the Osho guys. They have like beautiful big ideas, but they never do anything. They're like just big talkers and no action. And then
That
like
sounds like Eastern mysticism to me.
Yeah, something like that. Well, the Indian kind of guru stuff, people who get hooked into that seem like there's a lot more. It's very heady. It's very gnostic as well. It's all like kind of like, oh, my actions doesn't really matter, whatever I do. Anyway, but I think that as far as Christianity, like Tolkien has this idea of the long defeat. And I actually think that's what Christianity is in for right now. It's, if you read like the whole series of Middle Earth books, and the history of it, then it's just like this long defeat, basically, that's going all the way through it. And I think he kind of saw that, and has also written a little bit about how that reflects the Christian faith. And it's built into the story of Christ, right? Like Christ got crucified. So that's kind of like essential in it. So I know that most Orthodox churches in the West right now are seeing like an explosion in the number of catechumens that are coming in. But, we're talking thousands of people, not millions in any way whatsoever. And it's always like, I think it's always going to be a small margin. And then I think sometimes, when there's wars, then people go to which is really solid. And so you'll see like, after the First, Second World War, there was this massive kind of like, kind of fixation of like, established evangelical Christianity, and especially the United States. But it was Phariseeism, really, right? It was just people who were using Christian morals to hit other people in the head and make themselves feel better about themselves. And so it didn't last very well. And that's why it's falling to pieces at the moment. And unfortunately, a lot of people have been hurt by that as well. So I think that we will see a minority of people who will be seeing like, okay, things are going really crazy now. We need to connect to something old and true. And a significant portion of those people will find something like orthodoxy. I think Western Christianity is more and more kind of collapsing in on itself as well. I don't follow very closely in what's happening in like the Catholic Church, but it seems like, I can see a lot of really good things in Catholicism, and I also see like some really confused, weird stuff as well. But no, I view it a little bit as a long defeat. I don't have, I'm living in Denmark. We're probably like, 60 Danish Orthodox people in the whole country or something like that. But what it does do is it creates a very strong community of people. But, the people who I'm most closely connected to, and really is in this I live in a little town with about 300 people in it. And those are the people that I get to see. And, there isn't any Christians really here either. So what I find interesting is interacting with other people, and it's far more interesting to kind of be putting these ideas into work in my own life and into my own work. And that's been incredibly productive. And I can see how guys come to our events that we run in Maniphesto and just have another experience of being a human together with other human beings. There's an attitude of just engagement and embodiment with reality and yourself, which I think we've been able to do. And for me, it's very clear, like that's because I've dug into an old tradition and I've understood it, and I've understood how it fits together with all of the other, traditions of human history as well. So being able to take that, we create rituals, and these rituals are very pagan in many ways, but then we also lift them to like put guys through really challenging circumstances, and then we lift them to see, you can call it the overman. That's definitely one way that we see it, and we put that ideal up there afterwards as well. So it's not just about you and what can be pleasurable and good, like how to get, like, when we started this work, we had a lot of guys coming to us who are like looking, how can I like fuck for hours, and how can I like attract women better and stuff like that. And then more and more, it's like people are saying like, no, there's something more important than just me and pleasure and sex and getting my own ego supported by more money and power or whatever it is.
I'd be interested to know if you think there's any relationship between this idea of the long defeat, which does it ultimately, I'd ask the question, does it end in total defeat, and the connection potentially between this long defeat and the types of things that Nietzsche is talking about. Like maybe Nietzsche himself is a symptom of this long defeat.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely, this is eschatology we're going into. I don't know.
Yeah.
But
maybe it's a question to investigate for another time.
My understanding of the biblical narrative is that, like, it totally ends in defeat in this world, or not. I shouldn't even say in this world. Sorry, in this life, because the idea of heaven is actually like the Christian idea is that we will live. We will live in the world, on the earth. Not so that there is an idea of like life after death. That's a part of Christianity. Like you need to get over that if you, or like get to terms with that to deal with Christianity.
There is, yeah.
But it's only in life after death but in life, in this physical life, then it's defeat. Yeah, absolutely. That's what, like, Christ was crucified, right? Like there's this idea like, oh, Christ died so I don't have to, or something like that. It's like, no, he died so that to show the way, basically. The early Christianity was called the way.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. That the idea of Christ as a symbol dying is actually it's a paradoxical pointing the direction, and like I think we can juxtapose that symbol, the metaphor of Christ dying on the cross as the way, and in relationship to what we're told is the way in terms of 20th century pop culture, is like when you see fame or money or status or a certain social beauty ideal, a certain look, a certain beauty look as a woman, or a certain success status look as a man. When you juxtapose that against Christ on the cross, I mean, that's a total 180. So it's an interesting way to think about ethics, interesting way to think about becoming. And I think the one last point I'll make about Nietzsche is that I just want to echo the point you made to start the talk, which is that, it's interesting that I've got an Orthodox Christian on here who, when he first encounters Nietzsche's idea, says, well, looks like a Christ-like figure. And I think that would be in the context of the course I'm doing on Thus Spoke Zarathustra. This is one of the reasons why I'm doing the course on Thus Spoke Zarathustra, is because I want to get into the cracks. I want to get into the very, each passage, each section, and I want to investigate, sort of the ethics he's offering for the evolutionary universe and the modern universe, because I think that there is an important work to be done here that requires paradoxically a Christ-like figure. Mm-hmm. And I think Nietzsche does present himself explicitly as a Christ-like figure. And I think there are books where he actually says, even though I hate Christianity, I love Christ, or something like that. So I think even Nietzsche would accept, what we're saying here, and that's in itself interesting. So last thing I'll ask for you to do is maybe tell the viewers a little something about the Manifesto and the European Men's Gathering, because even though it's not explicitly a Christian organization, I think whether or not someone believes in God, or someone believes in the overman, or someone believes in whatever else, there's something really important about the work you're doing when it comes to what I would call, taking it from our shared friend and collaborator Alexander Barb, the process of adultification. Mm-hmm. That you're taking boys to become men, that is something we've lost in our culture. There is no more rites of passage. And I think that I went through it last year. I thought it was very powerful. I thought it was one of the most interesting events I've ever been to. And so maybe go a little bit into that, explore maybe what the viewers might take away from that, and link in the description to that event if you're interested in exploring it more yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Cadell. Yeah, so I mean, rites of passage have been performed by all cultures throughout all times, and it's something that secular society is like, oh no, all rituals and stuff like that, that's kind of like superstition. We don't need that anymore. But what we really find is actually rituals are the most important milestones in our lives a lot of the time, and they really make sense. And so there's a lot of people who put a lot of energy into kind of the boy to man initiation, which is seen as one of the most fundamental kind of steps in a society's creating adults. What we're really looking to do is for people who've already done that basic work and are ready to, from like, instead of boy to man, going man to leader. So we get people into contact with that part of themselves that can be the killer, the rapist, the murderer, whatever it is, and experiencing that through, you know, a series of different things. We get them far off into the countryside so we can kind of put people in pretty difficult situations, and it's difficult for them to come home. We normally have, like, you know, 140, we'll have like one guy who says like, okay, this is way too much, guys. Then, you know, we'll have a conversation with him. But what we do is then together go through a ritual process where that person is actually kind of, what happens is you go into liminal space, a rite of passage. Arno Rubinstein, who we have a lot of the theory from, kind of describes it as like, you know, the process of a caterpillar going to a butterfly. You go into mush in between, and what happens there is there's a kind of like people in that room, they let themselves go a little bit. They let go of their own stories about themselves, and they often share their stories about themselves, but they can perhaps find the parts which they're interpreting in a slightly dysfunctional way, or in a way that's self-sabotaging what they're trying to achieve with their lives. And so then what happens is that we can be put together in a slightly more productive approach to achieve the things that we're wanting to achieve, and set a new goal, get a new vision for ourselves. A lot of the time that's what happens. It's very much a journey to the underworld, kind of like the hero's journey thing. And so there's often a receiving of revelation down there as well. And so it's a very, you know, we take, because it's a leader training, it's not very controlled and tightly structured and rules and ways of doing stuff. It's a little bit more chaotic. Because we believe that life is chaotic, and we're really looking to build skills that people can take with them into their everyday life as well. So it's about putting you outside of your comfort zone and challenging guys in the community with other guys as well. And so the event is, you know, I'm just a small part of the event. We have a big team of volunteers that make it possible, and some incredibly talented guys that do some really, really powerful work. And then, you know, there's a big focus on like, okay, how to take this back into your life as well and integrate it afterwards as well. So yeah, we've been doing it for several years, and since 2017. I'd say, yeah, there's been a kind of team of 10 guys where Alexander Bard and myself have been the two kind of, we're at least the two central founders of the entire thing, but we've been really dependent on a big team of men to help us with it. And then it was last year that we really found like, okay, now we've really nailed it. Before that, we were kind of really experimenting with different approaches to this whole rite of passage and how do you do this in society. And so, you know, what I talk a little bit about patterns. And so one of the basic patterns of life is this idea of death, burial, and resurrection. And so that's what the event is patterned around, is that, you know, something to grow, something inside you have to die, or maybe you have to die and something else can be born or can resurrect like a phoenix after that as well. And so that's what guys share happens to them. And it's it's a powerful experience for us, and all of us learn a lot from doing it as well. Yeah.
I can say Paul's not, for anyone interested in going, Paul's not joking around either, because when I got to the event last year, he made us sign a document saying, you know, it's something like if you die or something like this at this event, we're not liable or something like that. I was like, okay. It's like this is not a regular. I'm not at an academic conference anymore. I'm not in Kansas anymore. You know, like, it's like, you know, and it really was a different experience. It really was a recreation of a liminal experience, and it really was embodied. And there were workshops, like anger workshops, that you know, particularly memorable here, and a whole theme that I think was very useful to go through. So, definitely check that out.
Guys come there and say like that, through all their military training, they never had a kind of warrior training the way that was so deep and powerful as what they did there as well, actually. So even guys who've actually been in armed conflict as well, like that. So yeah, that guys like Hai Pepping, like he does amazing work in that area. I think that's
really, absolutely. Check that out. We've got Maniphesto, the European Men's Gathering, which does boy to man and man to leader, rites of passage, and really do a good job of creating that liminal space and really do. I think they were, you really filling a hole here in our society where there really is, like sometimes people say women's rites of passages to go through pregnancy, and that's a very natural process. But for men, the rites of passages, there's something more that needs to be artificially simulated, maybe we could say. And I think that Maniphesto is doing a really good job of that. And connected to that this summer, and this is part of the larger Nietzsche dialogues we're doing here with the first one, I think really fitting to start off with Nietzsche versus Christianity, because it sort of sets the tone for the rest of Nietzsche's metaphysics. So thanks for coming on and doing that. The Thus Spoke Zarathustra course will be starting July 14th. So you could even do sort of combo deal, do a Thus Spoke Zarathustra course this summer and go to the European Men's Gathering and get a little rites of passage. And I think
we could figure out a little combo coupon or something.
It could be an interesting combination. I don't know, that there's definitely some synergy there. But thanks again for coming on, Paul. I'll let you have the last word. If there's anything you want to say about Nietzsche, anything you want to say about Christianity, anything you want to say about Maniphesto, the floor is yours, and then we'll sign off.
I'll just say thank you, Cadell, for the work that you're doing. I think it's great that you are going into discussions that some people wouldn't normally go to in your area and kind of breaking down some of those barriers and inviting me on here. And it was a really great experience to have you and your two co-authors of Sex, Masculinity, and God coming along to the European Men's Gathering last year and giving your works. I know you're going to be in Berlin here just like 2 weeks from now or something like that. We're going to see each other down there as well at Mansign Conference also. So I think it's great just that you're fully engaging in this at multiple levels and driving what I really see as vital conversations, not in a kind of way of like, oh yeah, everybody has to follow me and listen to me, but how can we be going into dialogue with different ideas and understanding our own positions better when we open ourselves to things that we haven't always been engaged with. So that's a great model. I think that can only lead to good results. So thanks.
Thank you, Paul. It's been great collaborating with you. And for everyone listening, this has been Nietzsche versus Christianity with Paul Robson, founder of Maniphesto. And stay tuned for the next month where we're going to be doing a Nietzsche dialogue series. We're going to be getting into gurus. We're going to get into competition. We're going to be getting into nihilism and meaning. And we're going to get into women, sexuality, and finally, the future. So stay with us, and this has been a great start to that series. So